252 million years ago, life on Earth nearly stopped existing. Not slowly, not in the way extinctions usually unfold, in pulses spread across millions of years, giving evolution time to respond, giving ecosystems time to reorganize around whatever survives. This was different. This was a collapse so rapid, so complete, so total, that when geologists look at the rock record from this specific moment, they see something that has no equivalent anywhere else in 4 billion years of planetary history. A boundary, a line. Below the line, the richest and most diverse marine ecosystems Earth had ever produced. Above the line, almost nothing. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of story you want more of, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this channel, and it takes just a moment. Alright, let us go deeper. The event is called the Permian-Triassic extinction. Scientists also call it the Great Dying, and both names are accurate. It was the greatest dying in the history of complex life on Earth. By the most careful estimates, approximately 97% of all marine species were eliminated. Approximately 70% of land vertebrate species. A similar fraction of insects, plants, and microorganisms. In terms of the sheer scale of biological information destroyed, of the irreversible erasure of evolutionary lineages that had developed over hundreds of millions of years, nothing before or since comes close. 97%. Think about what that means for a moment. Walk through any ocean, any reef, any coastal ecosystem you can imagine, and remove 97% of everything living there. Remove almost every species of coral, every family of fish, every type of cephalopod, every kind of reef-building organism. What remains is not a depleted ecosystem. What remains is barely an ecosystem at all. Just the scattered, stunned survivors of something that should not have been survivable. And we know roughly what caused it. The cause is not a mystery in the way that some extinction events are mysteries. The basic mechanism is understood. What is terrifying is not the mystery. What is terrifying is the mechanism itself, and what it implies about the fragility of the biological systems we depend on. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what existed. And what existed in the Permian period was extraordinary in ways that are genuinely surprising if you have never thought carefully about the deep history of life on Earth. The Permian period began approximately 299 million years ago and ended at the extinction boundary 252 million years ago. 47 million years. That is more time than separates us from the last dinosaurs. In 47 million years, evolution had built an extraordinary world. A world that, if you could visit it, would be both alien and recognizable. Familiar in its fundamental architecture. Alien in almost every specific detail. The continents were not where they are today. The slow movement of plate tectonics had gathered most of the world's landmass into a single supercontinent, which we call Pangaea. This was not a static arrangement. Pangaea was still in the process of consolidation at the beginning of the Permian, and was well established by the time the extinction arrived. A single enormous landmass, stretching from pole to pole, with a single enormous ocean surrounding it. The ocean is called Panthalassa. It covered most of the planet. The implications of this geography for climate and biology were enormous. A single supercontinent creates extreme continental interiors, far from the moderating influence of the ocean, experiencing ferocious temperature swings between seasons. The coasts of Pangaea were relatively warm and wet, supporting lush terrestrial ecosystems. The interior was hot and dry, a vast arid zone where only the most drought-tolerant life could persist. The shallow seas around the margins of Pangaea, and in the shallow embayment on its eastern side, called the Tethys Sea, were extraordinarily productive. In these shallow tropical and subtropical waters, life had been developing and diversifying for hundreds of millions of years. The Permian shallow marine ecosystem was the most complex and diverse the planet had yet produced. The reefs were not coral reefs in the way we understand them today. The primary reef builders of the Permian were organisms called rugose corals and tabulate corals, both now entirely extinct, and sponge-like organisms called calcareous sponges. These creatures constructed enormous three-dimensional reef structures that provided habitat for a staggering diversity of associated life. Brachiopods, which look superficially like clams but are an entirely different and only distantly related group, were the dominant filter feeders. In some Permian reef assemblages, brachiopods are so numerous that they form the primary rock-forming organism, their shells accumulating into beds meters thick. There were over 2,000 species of them. The ammonoids, the coiled and chambered mollusks that became the iconic fossils of ancient seas, were extraordinarily diverse. Hundreds of species, ranging from button size to the diameter of a wagon wheel, swimming in the waters of Panthalassa and the Tethys. The crinoids, the sea lilies, built dense forests on the seafloor. Blastoids, ancient relatives of sea urchins with flower-like tops, were so abundant in some Permian deposits that their ossicles make up a significant fraction of the limestone. Trilobites, the ancient arthropods whose family tree extended back to the Cambrian, were still present, reduced from their former diversity, but still a recognizable and significant component of marine ecosystems. In the deeper waters, the sharks and fish were diverse and sophisticated. The cartilaginous fishes had been evolving for over 200 million years by the Permian, and included forms we would not recognize alongside forms that are clearly the ancestors of modern sharks. The bony fishes were increasing in diversity. The seas were full. On land the picture was equally rich. The forests of the late Permian were not forests of flowering plants, which had not yet evolved. They were forests of seed ferns, conifers, cycads and ginkgos. In the wetter tropical regions, the Glossopteris flora, named for its tongue-shaped leaves, dominated the southern part of Pangaea. These were large, often tree-sized seed ferns that formed extensive forests in what is now Antarctica, India, South America, Africa and Australia, then all part of the southern portion of the supercontinent. In these forests, the terrestrial vertebrates had been diversifying spectacularly. The synapsids, the group of animals that includes all mammals and their ancestors, had been the dominant large land animals since the Carboniferous period and had become extraordinarily diverse in the Permian. The therapsids, a subgroup of synapsids, were particularly successful. They range from small insectivores to large herbivores to apex predators. The dicynodonts, strange pig-sized to hippopotamus-sized herbivores with two large tusks and a turtle-like beak, were among the most abundant large animals on the planet. The gorgonopsids were wolf to lion-sized predators with large saber-like teeth. The cynodonts, which would eventually give rise to mammals, were small to medium-sized animals already showing many of the anatomical features that define mammals, including differentiated teeth and evidence of warm-bloodedness. This was not a primitive world. This was a mature, complex, highly interconnected world of extraordinary biological richness. It had taken 400 million years of multicellular animal evolution to build it. In terms of ecological complexity, in terms of the diversity of strategies and forms and interactions, the late Permian biosphere was as sophisticated as anything that had existed before it. And then something happened in Siberia, in what is now the Siberian region of Russia, centered roughly on the West Siberian basin and extending across an area of approximately 2 million square kilometers. Something began approximately 252 million years ago that has no analogue in the last 500 million years of Earth history. Magma, an enormous volume of it, began forcing its way up through the crust. This was not a conventional volcanic eruption, not a Krakatoa, not a Tambora, not anything on the scale of what we would call a supervolcano. This was something of an entirely different category. The eruptions that built what is now called the Siberian Traps were not explosive volcanoes in the conventional sense. They were flood basalt eruptions, massive effusive events in which enormous volumes of fluid lava simply poured out of fissures in the earth over extended areas, covering the landscape in sheet after sheet of black basaltic rock. The Siberian Traps today, after 250 million years of erosion, still cover an area of approximately 2 million square kilometers, with an average thickness of several kilometers. The original extent was probably larger. The total volume of volcanic rock produced is estimated at approximately 3 million cubic kilometers. 3 million. For comparison, the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history, Mount Tambora in 1815, produced approximately 160 cubic kilometers of material. The Siberian Traps produced roughly 20,000 times that volume. But volume of rock is not what killed the biosphere. What killed the biosphere was what came out of the rock during its eruption. The gases, the volatiles that magma carries dissolved within it and releases into the atmosphere as the magma degasses during eruption. The dominant greenhouse gas released by volcanic eruptions is carbon dioxide. The Siberian Traps eruptions injected an enormous quantity of carbon dioxide into the Permian atmosphere. Estimates of the total carbon release range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of gigatons of carbon. The current rate of human carbon emissions, which climatologists consider extremely dangerous, is approximately 10 gigatons of carbon per year. The Siberian Traps may have released the equivalent of 10,000 to 100,000 years of modern human emissions. But there is a complication, and the complication is what makes the Siberian Traps story not just a story about carbon dioxide. The Siberian Traps eruptions did not occur over clean, geologically simple crust. They erupted through and into a thick sequence of sedimentary rock containing enormous deposits of coal, evaporites including salt beds and sulfate deposits, and carbonate rocks. As the magma intruded into and through these sedimentary sequences, it heated them, it cooked them, and cooking these specific rock types produced additional gases far more dangerous than the carbon dioxide from the basalt itself. Coal heated by magmatic intrusion releases enormous quantities of additional carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur dioxide. Evaporite beds heated by magma release chlorine compounds and sulfur compounds. Carbonate rocks thermally decomposed by magma release more carbon dioxide. The Siberian Traps were not just erupting fresh mantle-derived basalt. They were acting as a planetary-scale chemical reactor, cooking Permian sedimentary sequences and releasing their stored volatiles into the atmosphere in quantities that dwarfed the volcanic emissions themselves. This was only discovered in the early 21st century, when geologists began mapping the extent of contact metamorphism in the rocks adjacent to the Siberian Traps intrusions. The scale of sedimentary heating was enormous. The gas volumes involved were staggering, and the specific mix of gases produced — carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur dioxide, hydrogen chloride, halocarbons — was precisely the combination most effective at disrupting the atmosphere, the ocean chemistry, and the ozone layer simultaneously. This is what the world was being subjected to as the Permian ended. Not just a lot of volcanoes, a planetary-scale geochemical catastrophe that operated through multiple simultaneous mechanisms, each one individually serious, all of them operating together and amplifying each other's effects. Let us talk about carbon dioxide first, because it is the mechanism that operated on the longest timescale, and whose effects are the most thoroughly documented in the geological record. The Permian atmosphere before the extinction had carbon dioxide levels that, while higher than today, were within ranges that life had adapted to over millions of years. The climate was warm, particularly in the tropics, but biologically functional. Terrestrial plants were photosynthesizing. Marine organisms were building their carbonate shells and skeletons in chemistry-balanced oceans. The world was in an ecological and geochemical equilibrium, dynamic but stable. The volcanic carbon dioxide from the Siberian Traps began disrupting this equilibrium. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. More of it in the atmosphere traps more heat from the sun, raising global temperatures. This is the same mechanism driving current climate change. In the Permian, the scale of the carbon injection was vastly larger, and the rate was faster than anything life had previously experienced in its entire evolutionary history. Temperature reconstruction from oxygen isotope ratios preserved in fossil shells and in ancient seafloor sediments shows that tropical ocean surface temperatures rose by approximately 10 to 15 degrees Celsius during the extinction interval. 10 to 15 degrees. In some tropical regions, temperatures reach 38 to 40 degrees Celsius in the surface waters. At 40 degrees, the biochemistry of most marine organisms begins to fail. Proteins denature. Metabolic pathways shut down. Photosynthesis by marine phytoplankton collapses above certain temperature thresholds. The effect on terrestrial temperatures was similar or worse. The continentality of Pangaea meant that interior regions experienced even more extreme temperature swings than the global average. The deep interior of the supercontinent, already hot and dry in the Permian, became lethally hot and dry. The tropical belt, which had supported diverse forests, became a zone of killing heat. The poleward migration of climate zones that happened over decades to centuries was far too fast for most organisms to track. Plants could not move fast enough. Soil communities, which take thousands of years to develop, were simply cooked in place. This is what the initial warming phase of the extinction would have looked like on land. Forests dying in place as temperatures exceeded their tolerance ranges. Not fire, not a sudden event, but an inexorable browning and drying and dying of vegetation that had taken millions of years to develop. The soil communities that depended on that vegetation failing, the animals that depended on the vegetation, and the soil community starving. A cascade of ecological collapse driven by simple heat and drought, spreading across the continental interior of Pangaea like a slow fire. But the carbon dioxide story is not only about temperature, it is also about ocean chemistry. The ocean absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This is one of the mechanisms that naturally regulates atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. When carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it forms carbonic acid. More carbon dioxide means more carbonic acid means lower ocean pH. This is ocean acidification, and it is one of the most important and most thoroughly documented mechanisms of the Permian extinction. Ocean acidification at the levels implied by the Siberian traps, carbon injection, would have had immediate and catastrophic effects on calcifying marine organisms. Corals, brachiopods, mollusks, echinoderms, bryozoans, all of the major groups of marine organisms that build their shells or skeletons from calcium carbonate depend on the ocean being supersaturated with carbonate to do so. When the pH drops and carbonate saturation falls, these organisms cannot build their skeletons. Existing shells and skeletons begin to dissolve. The fundamental chemistry of the marine ecosystem becomes hostile to the organisms that built it. The evidence for ocean acidification at the Permian-Triassic boundary is preserved in the rock record. The carbonate rocks that had been accumulating continuously in the Permian shallow seas simply stop at the boundary. Not immediately below the boundary there are limestones full of shells and reef structures. At the boundary itself and above it, the carbonate rocks disappear and are replaced by shales and mudstones, rocks that form in anoxic, acidified, desoxic conditions where no calcifying life can survive. The carbonate factory stopped, the reefs died, the shell builders disappeared. This is what ocean acidification looks like in the fossil record, a line in the rock, below which the ocean was full of shells and reefs, above which it was chemically hostile to the organisms that build them. Now let us talk about the second mechanism, the one that, in combination with the warming and acidification, turned a severe extinction into the most devastating in Earth's history. Oxygen. The deep ocean requires a supply of oxygen-rich water from the surface to support aerobic life. This supply is maintained by ocean circulation. Cold, dense, oxygen-rich water sinks from the surface at high latitudes and flows along the ocean floor carrying oxygen to the deep. When this circulation works properly, even the deepest ocean trenches contain enough oxygen for life to persist. The Permian warming disrupted this circulation. As surface ocean temperatures rose, the temperature gradient between tropical and polar waters decreased. The cold, dense water that normally sinks at high latitudes became warmer and less dense. The circulation weakened, and as circulation weakened, the supply of oxygen to the deep ocean decreased. The deep ocean has organisms in it that consume oxygen through respiration and decomposition. Bacteria, benthic animals, the constant chemical decomposition of organic matter settling from above. In a well-circulated ocean, the oxygen consumption is balanced by the supply. In a sluggish, poorly circulated ocean, consumption outstrips supply. The oxygen level falls, and eventually the deep ocean becomes anoxic, oxygen-free. The geological evidence for Permian ocean anoxia is compelling and extensive. Black shales, which form in oxygen-free conditions where organic matter is preserved rather than decomposed, are abundant in the Permian-Triassic boundary rocks globally. The carbon isotope record shows characteristic excursions consistent with widespread marine anoxia and organic carbon burial. Chemical markers called biomarkers, molecular fossils of specific types of bacteria, show evidence of sulfidic conditions in what had been oxygenated shallows. The ocean became stratified, oxygen-rich water near the surface, dead, oxygen-poor water below. This stratification was catastrophic for the immense diversity of marine life that lived at depth. Benthic communities, the organisms that lived on and in the seafloor, were among the hardest hit. When anoxic bottom waters expanded upward toward the shelf, they killed everything in their path. The warm, acidified, oxygen-poor waters were a poison advancing up the continental slopes and onto the shallow shelves. And here is where things get even worse. In oxygen-free water with abundant organic matter, a specific group of bacteria flourishes. These are sulfate-reducing bacteria. They consume sulfate dissolved in seawater and produce hydrogen sulfide as a metabolic byproduct. Hydrogen sulfide is the gas that smells like rotten eggs. It is also one of the most acutely toxic compounds in Earth's chemistry. Concentrations as low as a few parts per million in air are immediately dangerous to most complex life. Higher concentrations are rapidly lethal. In a well-oxygenated ocean, hydrogen sulfide produced by seafloor bacteria is immediately oxidized and rendered harmless before it can accumulate. In an anoxic ocean, there is no oxygen to oxidize it. The hydrogen sulfide accumulates. In the severely stratified ocean of the Permian extinction, geochemical evidence suggests that hydrogen sulfide concentrations in the deep ocean and eventually in shallow water reached levels that were toxic to virtually all complex marine life. The geological evidence for hydrogen sulfide toxicity at the Permian-Triassic boundary is one of the most striking findings of the past 2 decades of research. Biomarker compounds called isoreneratane, produced only by specific photosynthetic sulfur bacteria that require both light and hydrogen sulfide, are found in boundary rocks at multiple locations around the world. These bacteria only exist in the photic zone, the upper sunlit layer of the ocean. For hydrogen sulfide to reach the photic zone, the anoxic layer must have expanded all the way to the surface in those regions. The evidence suggests that large areas of the shallow ocean, the very areas most densely inhabited by marine life, became bathed in toxic, sulfurous, oxygen-free water. Think about what that means. The shallow reefs of the Tethys Sea, the most biodiverse marine environment on the planet, the accumulated product of hundreds of millions of years of evolution, did not drown in a slow decline. They were poisoned. The water itself became toxic. The chemistry turned against life in a way that was geologically almost instantaneous, and the hydrogen sulfide did not stay in the ocean. At concentrations high enough, hydrogen sulfide bubbles out of solution and enters the atmosphere. The geochemical models constrained by the isotopic and biomarker evidence suggest that during the peak of the extinction, hydrogen sulfide emissions from the ocean surface were significant enough to be directly toxic to terrestrial life in coastal regions. The gas would have blown on shore in prevailing winds, killing coastal vegetation and animals, contributing to the terrestrial extinction that was already underway from the warming and drying. There is a fourth mechanism, one that has become better understood in the past decade, and that helps explain why the terrestrial extinction was even more severe than the marine one in some respects: the ozone layer. The stratospheric ozone layer is the filter that shields the surface of the Earth from ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Without it, the surface receives UV fluxes that are directly lethal to many organisms, damaging DNA and disrupting photosynthesis. The ozone layer is maintained by chemical reactions involving oxygen, and it is disrupted by chlorine and bromine compounds, the same compounds that caused the Antarctic ozone hole when human-produced CFCs were released into the atmosphere. The Siberian Traps eruptions, particularly as they heated the halide-rich evaporite sequences in the Permian sedimentary record, released large quantities of chlorine and bromine compounds into the atmosphere, the same volcanic thermogenic reactions that produced the carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds from cooking sedimentary rocks also produced organohalides, chlorinated and brominated organic molecules that, once in the stratosphere, participate in ozone-destroying chemical reactions. The evidence for ozone depletion at the Permian-Triassic boundary is preserved in fossil spores and pollen from boundary-age sediments. Spores produced during the extinction interval show abnormal features consistent with elevated UV exposure. Malformed spores and pollen are found at multiple sites around the world at exactly the boundary level. The signal is consistent with a globally elevated UV flux during the extinction, exactly what you would predict from a major ozone depletion event. For terrestrial plants, elevated UV would have been an additional catastrophic stressor layered on top of the temperature and precipitation changes. For the shallow marine ecosystem, elevated UV penetrating further into the water column would have damaged the photosynthetic organisms at the base of the food web. The ozone depletion mechanism was not the primary killer, but it did not need to be the primary killer to be deadly. It was one more simultaneous hammer blow in a cascade of hammer blows. If you are settling in tonight and you want to keep exploring stories like this one, now is a good time to subscribe if you have not already. Leave a like as well. It helps this channel keep making these videos. Alright, let us go back to the dying world. Let us now put together the timeline. Because the specific sequence of how these mechanisms operated matters for understanding why the extinction was so severe, so geologically sudden, and why 97% is not an exaggeration. The Siberian Traps eruptions did not begin suddenly. They ramped up. The first major phase of eruption began perhaps 252.5 million years ago. In the earliest phase, the gas injections were significant, but the Earth's systems could partially buffer them. Carbon dioxide levels rose, temperatures increased, the marine calcification was stressed, but the biosphere was still functioning. Organisms were stressed, mortality was elevated, but extinction on a massive scale had not yet begun. Then something changed. The most recent high-precision dating work, particularly the work of Seth Burgess, Ben Black and their colleagues, published in the early 2010s, suggests that there was a catastrophic intensification of the eruptions approximately 252 million years ago that coincides with the main extinction pulse. This intensification is associated with the largest phase of magmatic intrusion into the Permian sedimentary sequences, the phase that would have produced the maximum thermogenic gas release from cooked coal and evaporite beds. The best estimates from high-resolution biostratigraphic work suggest that the main pulse of marine extinction, the phase in which most of the 97% disappeared, occurred over a period of approximately 60,000 years. 60,000 years is a geological instant. 60,000 years ago in human terms is when modern humans were painting caves and following mammoths across Eurasia. But in terms of the biological systems involved, 60,000 years is catastrophically fast. Evolution cannot respond at that speed. Ecological systems do not recover at that speed. Within that 60,000-year window, the mechanisms we have been discussing operated simultaneously and interactively. The warming and acidification weakened the calcifying organisms. The anoxia killed the benthic communities. The hydrogen sulfide poisoned the shallows. The UV radiation damaged the photosynthesizers. Each mechanism made the others worse. Organisms weakened by heat stress are more vulnerable to acidification. Organisms weakened by acidification are more vulnerable to anoxia. The cascade was not linear, each step following the previous one in an orderly sequence. It was simultaneous, multiple systems failing at once, the failure each accelerating the failure of the others. This is what made it 97% rather than 50%. Not the severity of any individual mechanism, but the simultaneity of multiple mechanisms and the feedback loops between them. And at the centre of all of it was a chain reaction that, once started, could not be stopped. The warming of the oceans reduced their capacity to hold dissolved oxygen. The reduced oxygen expanded the anoxic zones. The anoxic zones increased hydrogen sulfide production. The hydrogen sulfide reduced the populations of organisms that normally consume organic matter aerobically. The dead organic matter accumulated and was decomposed by more sulfate-reducing bacteria, producing more hydrogen sulfide. The hydrogen sulfide that reached the atmosphere contributed to ozone depletion. The ozone depletion increased UV flux. The increased UV flux damaged photosynthesizers. The reduced photosynthesis decreased the oxygen production that might have helped reoxygenate the ocean. The ocean became more anoxic, a self-sustaining, self-amplifying chain of coupled catastrophes. Initiated by the Siberian traps, maintained by the geochemical feedbacks it triggered, running until the biological substrate that fueled it was largely consumed. Now let us think about what it was like to live through this, not as an academic exercise, as a genuine attempt to inhabit the experience of organisms caught in the worst catastrophe in the history of complex life on Earth. Take a rugose coral in a Permian reef in the Tethys Sea. This coral is the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Its anatomy is complex. Its relationship with the reef ecosystem is intricate. It depends on specific chemistry, specific temperatures, specific light levels, specific populations of the microscopic algae that live symbiotically within its tissues. It is a biological marvel, as sophisticated in its own way as anything that lives today. In the years before the extinction peak, this coral's world begins to change. The water is slightly warmer than it has been. Its symbiotic algae, which are sensitive to temperature, begin to behave differently. At certain temperatures, stressed algae release toxins and the coral expels them, an event we call bleaching today because it leaves the coral white. The coral that has expelled its algae has lost its primary energy source. It must feed entirely through filter feeding, which provides insufficient energy for growth and reproduction. Bleached corals do not die immediately. They starve slowly. At the same time, the chemistry of the water around the coral is changing. The pH is dropping as more carbon dioxide dissolves from the atmosphere. Carbonate saturation is decreasing. The coral is trying to build its skeleton in water that is no longer strongly supersaturated with carbonate. The construction of new skeleton becomes energetically more expensive. Growth slows. Reproduction decreases. The reef is visibly shrinking. Then the temperature continues to rise. The thermal threshold for coral physiology is crossed. The biochemical machinery that built the skeleton, that maintained the tissue, that regulated ion transport across cell membranes, begins to fail. The proteins that drive these processes evolved in a stable thermal environment and cannot function above their design temperature. The coral cannot survive in water this warm. It dies. But it does not die in the way we might imagine, dramatically, suddenly, in some recognisable catastrophic moment. It dies the way all organisms die of environmental stress, slowly, invisibly, from the inside. Metabolic processes failing one by one, tissue necrosis, the skeleton remaining while the living tissue retreats, the empty skeleton then being colonised by the boring organisms that had previously been held in check by the living coral, the reef, dissolving from within while the water that killed it continues to warm around it. Multiply this across every coral of every species in the Tethys Sea, in every carbonate shelf environment globally, over decades, then centuries, then thousands of years, as the warming continues and the acidification deepens and the anoxia spreads. The reefs do not die all at once. They die the way forests die in drought, with individual death events that seem survivable until the cumulative scale of them becomes clear, until the reef community itself, which depends on the living reef for its structure and its habitat, begins to fail, until the organisms that depended on the reef for shelter and food start dying because the reef that supported them is gone. The brachiopods go next, or simultaneously, because their calcification is also suppressed by the acidification, and their filtration is disrupted when the water column becomes turbid with dying organisms and their metabolic byproducts. The crinoids, the sea lilies that had been anchored to the reef surface for their entire lives, die in place as the water chemistry around them changes. Their ossicles, the tiny calcified plates that make up their stems and arms, fall to the seafloor and accumulate in a layer that geologists can find today. A rain of death preserved in Triassic limestone. The ammonoids, more mobile than the sessile reef builders, can swim away from locally deteriorating conditions. They do. The ammonoid record from the Permian-Triassic boundary shows a dramatic reduction in diversity, but also evidence of geographic movement, species retreating toward polar refugia, where temperatures remained cooler. But even the mobile organisms are running out of places to go. The planet is warming everywhere. The chemistry is changing everywhere. The anoxia is spreading everywhere. There are no permanent refugia. There's only varying degrees of badness, and the organisms are moving toward the least bad options, which are getting worse. In the deepest waters of Panthalassa, far from the warming shallows, the benthic communities face a different version of the same catastrophe. The oxygen minimum zone, which in a healthy ocean is confined to a specific depth range, is expanding. The anoxic water is creeping upward and outward, invading habitats that have been oxygenated for hundreds of millions of years. The organisms living in these habitats have no warning, no adaptation to deal with the change. Their oxygen supply simply decreases, their metabolic rate falls, their reproduction stops, they die. The smell of a dying Permian ocean would have been extraordinary and terrible. The hydrogen sulfide rising from the oxygen-depleted waters gives the smell of rotten eggs on an oceanic scale. The decomposing organic matter of billions of dead organisms adds to it. The sea surface in affected regions would have been discoloured, stained by the blooms of the specific bacteria that thrive in this chemistry. A purple haze of bacterial mats in regions where hydrogen sulfide reached the surface waters. The ocean, which had been one of the most productive and complex ecosystems in Earth's history, becoming a chemical wasteland. On land, the story was different in its specific mechanisms, but equally total in its outcome. The forests of the late Permian, particularly the Glossopteris flora of the southern supercontinent, were dying. The immediate signal in the geological record is the coal gap. Below the Permian-Triassic boundary, There are coal beds, the compressed remains of ancient peat and forest litter. Coal requires abundant plant matter, specifically the accumulation of organic material faster than it can decompose. You need forests to make coal. At the boundary, the coal beds stop, not gradually, abruptly. Above the boundary, coal is essentially absent for the first few million years of the Triassic. The coal gap is the signature of a world without forests. Why did the forests die? Multiple simultaneous causes, exactly as in the marine realm. The acid rain produced by sulfur dioxide emissions from the Siberian traps would have damaged vegetation directly, leaching nutrients from soils and directly acidifying plant tissue. The temperature increase dried the soils that many plant communities depended on. The UV increase damaged DNA and pollen and spores, reducing plant reproduction. The combination was lethal for plant communities adapted to Permian conditions. The loss of the forests is one of the most profound aspects of the terrestrial extinction, because forests are not just collections of trees, they're entire systems. They modify local climate by transpiration and shading. They build and stabilize soils over thousands of years. They support the entire food web of the terrestrial ecosystem, from the herbivores that eat them to the predators that eat the herbivores. When the forests die, everything that lives within and because of them dies too. The vertebrate record from the Permian-Triassic boundary on land tells the story of this collapse. The rich therapsid fauna of the late Permian, the dicynodonts and gorgonopsids and cynodonts and their relatives, was almost entirely eliminated. The gorgonopsids, the dominant terrestrial predators of the Permian, went entirely extinct at the boundary. Not a single species survived. The entire clade, with its complex anatomy and its behavioral sophistication and its millions of years of evolutionary refinement, erased. The dicynodonts, the numerous and diverse Permian herbivores, suffered similarly catastrophic losses. A few lineages survived the extinction, reduced to one or a handful of species from the dozens that had existed. The reduction in herbivore diversity was matched by a reduction in their ecological roles. The complex web of grazing and browsing and seed dispersal and habitat modification that the Permian herbivore community provided was simplified to nearly nothing. The insect record shows an equally dramatic collapse. Insects are among the most diverse and ecologically important organisms on land, and they have generally been resilient through Earth's mass extinctions. But the Permian-Triassic boundary is the only mass extinction in which insects show a major extinction event. The evidence from fossil insect deposits shows a dramatic reduction in insect diversity and abundance across the boundary, consistent with the collapse of the plant communities that most insects depend on. The pollination networks, the decomposition networks, the food webs built on insect biomass, all of them disrupted by the disappearance of the plants that anchored them. Think about walking through a Permian landscape in the final years before the peak of the extinction. The forests are thinning. The canopy is gaps where mature trees have died without replacement. The understory vegetation is stressed. The ferns and seed ferns that normally fill the forest floor looking desiccated. The soil underfoot is dry and cracked where it should be moist. The animal sounds are fewer than they were. The insects that should be everywhere are sparse. The dicynodonts that you would have seen grazing in herds are harder to find. The water sources that animals depend on are shrinking. This is not the sudden apocalypse of a meteor impact. This is the slow collapse of a biological system under conditions it was not built to tolerate. Each individual death seems like bad luck. The collective pattern is extinction, and then the conditions get worse, and worse still. What does it feel like when a world ends? Not the moment of ending. That is not the hardest part. The hardest part is the period before, when you can sense that something is wrong but cannot yet understand the scale of what is happening. When the patterns that you were born into, that your parents and their parents were born into, that the entire history of your kind on this planet has been built around, begin to fail. When the food becomes harder to find, when the seasons stop working the way they always have, when the young ones that should survive do not survive. An animal in the Permian is not aware of the Siberian traps. It is not aware of carbon dioxide concentrations or ocean pH or the spreading anoxic zones. What it is aware of is hunger and heat and thirst and the failing of the things it relies on. And what the biological record tells us about the Permian extinction is that this awareness, if you can call it that, in organisms whose subjective experience is entirely beyond our recovery, was a long, drawn-out experience of the world becoming less. The descendant herds moving across the increasingly arid interior of Pangaea in search of the plants that had fed their ancestors, finding less of it each year. The rivers running lower in summer than they used to, the waterholes shrinking, the sedges and reeds that lined the water disappearing, the young animals weaker than their parents had been because the food they're growing up on is less nutritious, less abundant, less reliable. The population declining slowly, then faster, as the breeding success falls below replacement. There is a specific type of bone preservation from the Permian-Triassic boundary that speaks to this directly. Bone bed deposits, where the remains of many individuals of the same species are concentrated in one place, sometimes occur when large numbers of animals died together at water sources during drought. There are such deposits from near the extinction boundary, the remains of dicynodonts and other Permian herbivores concentrated around drying river channels. The story in the bones is not predation, it is thirst. Animals that walked to the last remaining water and found it gone. But there were survivors, and the survivors of the worst catastrophe in Earth's history went on to inherit the planet and to give rise to the biological world we live in today. Understanding what they were and why they survived when 97% did not is the most important part of this story. Among the marine survivors, the pattern is interesting and partially understood. The organisms that survived the Permian-Triassic extinction were disproportionately those that were either small and metabolically simple, capable of tolerating a wider range of chemical and thermal conditions, or they were motile, able to move and track the least bad conditions as the catastrophe unfolded, or they had anatomical features that were somewhat buffered against the specific stresses of the extinction. The bivalve mollusks, what we call clams and mussels, survived when their ecological equivalents, the brachiopods, were nearly eliminated. Why? Several factors probably contributed. Bivalves can tolerate a wider range of oxygen conditions than brachiopods. They can survive temporarily in low oxygen water that would kill a brachiopod. They have a more flexible physiology in some respects. The extinction was not random. It selected against specific biological strategies, and for others, and the bivalve strategy turned out to be more compatible with the post-extinction world than the brachiopod strategy. The fish survived in reduced diversity. The ammonoid survived in reduced diversity, and then diversified rapidly in the early Triassic, filling many of the ecological roles vacated by the extinction with new species. The recovery of the ammonoids is one of the more dramatic evolutionary radiations in the fossil record, from a few surviving lineages to extraordinary diversity within a few million years. In the terrestrial realm, the survivors were similarly filtered in ways that reflect the specific stresses of the extinction. The archosaurs, the group that would eventually give rise to dinosaurs, crocodilians, and birds, survived the extinction, probably because of a combination of metabolic and behavioral features that allowed them to tolerate the harsh conditions of the early Triassic. The cynodonts, the therapsid subgroup most closely related to mammals, survived in small-bodied forms, possibly because small body size was advantageous when food was scarce. The small body sizes of Triassic tetrapods compared to Permian ones is a documented pattern, what paleontologists call the Lilliput effect, where survivors of a mass extinction tend to be smaller than their predecessors. Among the plants, the conifers and ferns proved more resilient than the seed fern Glossopteris flora that had dominated the Permian. Ferns in particular are extremely resistant to stress and colonize disturbed habitats readily. The early Triassic is characterized by what some researchers call the fern spike, a brief period during which ferns dominated the terrestrial plant community with very little diversity, because ferns were the organisms best positioned to exploit the disturbed, stressed conditions of the extinction aftermath. The world after the Great Dying was a fern wasteland compared to the forest diversity of the Permian. What is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about the Permian-Triassic extinction is not the dying. It is the aftermath, the recovery. Or rather, the near absence of recovery for a very long time. After most mass extinctions, the biosphere begins to rebuild within a few 100,000 to a couple of million years. The survivors diversify. New ecological roles vacated by the extinct taxa are filled by the expanding lineages of the survivors. Life bounces back. The diversity curve drops and then rises again. This is the pattern for the Endordovician extinction, the late Devonian extinction, the end Cretaceous extinction that killed the dinosaurs. The Permian-Triassic extinction did not follow this pattern. The recovery was delayed, severely, painfully. The early Triassic is characterized by what paleontologists call the Triassic dead zone, a period of approximately 5 to 8 million years during which marine diversity barely recovered, during which the ecological complexity of the pre-extinction world remained far below normal, during which the biological pump in the ocean, the process by which organic matter is produced at the surface and exported to depth, was severely disrupted. Why was the recovery so slow? Several factors contributed. One is that the conditions that caused the extinction, the high temperatures and low oxygen and acidified oceans, did not simply end at the extinction boundary. They persisted, and in some respects got worse, for millions of years afterward. There were multiple additional extinction pulses in the early Triassic, smaller than the main PT event but severe enough to reset recovering populations. The world was not simply waiting to be recolonized, it was continuing to be hostile. A second factor is ecological. The organisms most efficient at building complex ecosystems, the reef builders, the foundation species that create habitat for hundreds of other species, were the ones most severely affected. Without the reef builders, without the carbonate factory, without the complex three-dimensional structure that reefs provide, the shallow marine ecosystem could not rebuild into its former complexity no matter how many survivors there were. The foundations of the ecosystem had been destroyed. It took approximately 10 million years for marine diversity to recover to something approaching Permian levels. 10 million years. That is almost exactly the time separating us from the most recent common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees. A recovery timescale so long that every species alive today could have evolved twice over in the time it took the Permian Ocean to recover from a few 100,000 years of Siberian volcanism. The world that eventually emerged from the recovery was not the same world that had existed before. The dominant reef builders were now different organisms. The dominant large marine predators were different. The dominant terrestrial vertebrates were different. The world of the Mesozoic, the world of the dinosaurs and the flying reptiles and the marine ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, was built on the ecological space vacated by the Great Dying. The dinosaurs did not exist in the Permian. They could not have existed in the Permian. The world was too full of the things that came before them. It took the largest extinction in Earth's history to create the ecological space in which they could evolve. And 250 million years after that, it took the second largest mass extinction, the asteroid impact 66 million years ago, to create the ecological space in which our own lineage could evolve from small, nocturnal, marginal mammals into the dominant large animals of the planet. We are, in a very specific and literal sense, the inheritors of catastrophe. The mammals that gave rise to all of today's placental mammal diversity, including us, are synodonts that survived the Great Dying when 97% did not. Our lineage's very existence is conditional on the survival of our Permian ancestors through the worst event in Earth's history. If the extinction had been 100% rather than 97%, if those few synodont lineages had not made it through, there would be no mammals. There would be no us. The 4% that survived is the entire biological inheritance of the modern world. Let us now ask the question that the title of this video explicitly invites, but that any responsible treatment of this subject must handle carefully. The title says a single week. I need to be honest with you about what that means and what it does not mean. The Permian Triassic extinction did not literally occur in 7 days. No geological event of this scale, no biological collapse of this magnitude, happens in 7 days. The main pulse of marine extinction occurred over approximately 60,000 years, based on the best current high-resolution dating. The full extinction interval from the beginning of the eruptions to the peak of the die-off was longer still. What the title is gesturing at is something real, but something that requires careful framing. In geological terms, 60,000 years is barely a moment. Geologists working with long stratigraphic sections routinely work with time units of millions of years. A 60,000-year event in a 252 million year old sequence is visible in the rock record as essentially a line, not a zone. The transition from a world full of life to a world nearly empty of it appears in the outcrop as a boundary you can put your finger on. Below it, a world. Above it, near nothing. And there is a more specific sense in which the most catastrophic phase of the extinction may have been devastatingly rapid. The models of hydrogen sulfide release, constrained by the geochemical and biomarker evidence, suggest that once the ocean chemistry crossed a specific threshold, the hydrogen sulfide buildup may have occurred on timescales of years to decades, not millions of years, not thousands of years, decades. The tipping point dynamic in the ocean chemistry once triggered ran fast. If there was a moment when organisms across vast areas of the shallow sea were acutely poisoned by hydrogen sulfide reaching lethal concentrations, That moment may have been ecologically very rapid, even if the geological processes that produced it were long in development. The death of individuals happens on the timescale of the poison. The death of populations happens on a timescale of generations. The death of species happens on the timescale of the worst conditions being sustained long enough that no refuge remains. The title is a dramatic compression of a real pattern. The great dying, once triggered by the Siberian traps, unfolded through mechanisms that, at their fastest and most catastrophic, were acutely rapid. Not a week, but fast enough that in the life of an individual organism, the world could change from survivable to unsurvivable within its own lifetime, within a parent's lifetime and its child's lifetime, within the span of experience that constitutes the world for any living thing. There is something specific about the Permian-Triassic extinction that connects it to our own moment in a way that most deep time stories do not. The mechanism is familiar. The Siberian traps injected carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at a rate that caused catastrophic warming and ocean chemistry changes. The rate of injection was fast by geological standards and caused a climate transition that exceeded the adaptive capacity of the biosphere. Human industrial activity is currently injecting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a rate that may be, by some estimates, faster than the Siberian traps injection rate at the peak of the Permian extinction. The absolute amounts are different, the duration is different, the starting conditions are different. The modern biosphere is also not the same as the Permian biosphere, and many modern organisms have evolved in environments more variable than the stable Permian climate. The situations are not identical, and the comparison should not be made carelessly. But the underlying physical and chemical mechanisms are the same. More carbon dioxide means more warming. More warming means less ocean circulation. Less ocean circulation means less deep water oxygenation. Less oxygenation means expanding anoxic zones. More anoxic zones mean more hydrogen sulfide. Ocean acidification damages calcifying organisms. These are not Permian-specific phenomena. They are chemistry. They work the same way regardless of the time period. The Permian-Triassic extinction is not a prophecy. It is not inevitable fate. The situations are different enough that we cannot simply extrapolate from the great dying to the present. But it is a demonstration, a proof of concept in the geological record, a demonstration that the climate mechanisms we are activating are capable, under specific conditions of sufficient magnitude and speed, of causing the worst biological catastrophe in Earth's history. The distance between demonstration and certainty is important. We are not doing what the Siberian traps did, but we are doing something that uses the same basic chemical and physical levers. The geological record of the Permian-Triassic boundary is not a threat. It is a calibration, a data point about what these mechanisms are capable of at the extreme end of the range, about how bad the bad end of the range actually is. Every scientist who works on the Permian-Triassic extinction is aware of this parallel. Most of them are careful about how they discuss it, because the science should be presented accurately and the comparison should not be overstated. But all of them are aware that they are studying a past demonstration of mechanisms that are currently being activated at a fraction of their Permian intensity, and that the demonstration is one of the most sobering data sets in all of Earth science. We know what happens when these levers are pushed hard. We have the record. It is in the rocks. 97%, 5 to 10 million years of delayed recovery. An entire biological world destroyed and replaced by something different. That is not a prediction. It is a boundary condition, a data point at the extreme end of the range. The challenge is to understand where in the range we currently are and to use that understanding wisely. What does a recovery from catastrophe look like across the deepest possible timescale? The first million years after the Permian-Triassic boundary are, in the fossil record, bleak. The diversity metrics are drastically reduced. The ecological complexity is a fraction of what it had been. The organisms that existed in this interval are the survivors doing what survivors do, reproducing as efficiently as possible in a simplified world, exploiting whatever resources remain, waiting for the conditions to become survivable enough for populations to grow and diversify. Then, slowly, the diversity begins to recover. The fern spike gives way to diversifying plant communities as conditions gradually improve. The ammonoids, which had been reduced to a handful of species, begin radiating into new forms. The archosaurs begin the evolutionary experiments that will eventually produce dinosaurs. The cynodonts, the mammal ancestors, continue their own evolutionary exploration of small-bodied ecological space. By approximately 15 million years after the extinction, the marine diversity has reached perhaps half of its pre-extinction levels. By 20 million years it is most of the way back. By the Middle Triassic, complex reef ecosystems are beginning to rebuild, not with the same organisms as before, but with new organisms playing similar ecological roles. The calcifying sponges and rugose corals that built Permian reefs are gone. Scleractinian corals, a new group of coral builders, emerge in the Triassic and become the primary reef builders of the Mesozoic and today. The ecological function is preserved. The specific organisms filling it are new. This is the fundamental pattern of recovery from mass extinction. The roles persist because the physical environment continues to provide the conditions for those roles. Reefs exist because the chemistry and physics of shallow tropical marine environments favors reef building. Something will always fill that role given enough time. What that something is changes. The Permian reef builders are gone. The Mesozoic reef builders evolved to take their place. Today's coral reef builders evolved to take the place of the Mesozoic ones. The role endures. The occupants turn over. This should be both comforting and sobering. Comforting because it suggests that the biosphere, given enough time and a return to stable conditions, will recover. The Great Dying did not permanently damage life's capacity to exist on Earth. The planet recovered, more slowly than from any previous extinction. But it recovered. Sobering because 10 million years is not a human timescale, not a civilizational timescale, not a timescale on which any meaningful continuity with the pre-extinction biological world was maintained. The organisms that recovered into the early and middle Triassic were not the organisms that existed in the late Permian. They were new organisms, descendants of the survivors, occupying the ecological space of the dead. The Permian biosphere, the specific assemblage of species that had evolved over hundreds of millions of years, was gone. It did not come back. Something else came back in its place. In the Permian rock formations of South Africa, in the Karoo Basin, there is a layer that geologists use as their reference point for the Permian-Triassic boundary on land. Below this layer, the red and green mudstones of the Permian-Beaufort group, full of the bones and teeth and trace fossils of the diverse therapsid fauna of the late Permian, Dicynodont burrow traces, Gorgonopsid footprints, the signature of a world inhabited by complex communities of large vertebrates. At the boundary, the rock changes character. The mudstones become more homogeneous, less varied in their chemical signature. The vertebrate bone beds thin dramatically. The diversity of footprint types decreases to a handful, and then, above the boundary, something strange. The earliest Triassic sediments in the Karoo show almost no vertebrate diversity for several meters of section, representing perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. Just one or two species of small dicynodont and cynodont surviving in a world that had previously supported dozens. Then, higher up in the section, diversity begins to rebuild. New forms appear. The archosaurs make their appearance, and eventually, millions of years later, the familiar fauna of the Triassic establishes itself, and the world is full of large animals again. Standing at that boundary in the Karoo, looking down at the late Permian beds with their abundant fossil evidence of a rich biological world, and then looking up at the impoverished early Triassic beds above them, you can hold in a single glance the greatest biological catastrophe in Earth's history. Below you, a world. Above you, near nothing. Between them, a line you can step over in a single stride that represents the worst event in 4 billion years of life. That line is real. It is there. Geologists have stood at it on every continent. It has the same character everywhere. Abundance below, desolation above. And a Siberian volcanic province burning 252 million years ago as the cause. Let the magnitude of this settle gently around you, not as a source of despair, as a source of the specific awe that comes from understanding the depth of the history your world is built on. You are alive because a few cynodont lineages survived the worst catastrophe in Earth's history. Your mammalian ancestors were small. They were probably burrowing or semi-fossorial, able to escape the worst of the surface heat in burrows. They are probably omnivorous, able to eat whatever remained when their preferred food was gone. They had the metabolic flexibility of warm-blooded animals that could regulate their own temperature even as the environment became hostile. They were lucky. They were in the right place. They were the 4%. From those few animals in the desolate early Triassic, the entire mammalian lineage descends. 252 million years of evolution, through the age of dinosaurs and the recovery of the planet and the great radiation of mammals after the asteroid impact, and the appearance of primates and the evolution of the human lineage and everything that has happened since. All of it contingent on those few survivors making it through. The biosphere we inhabit, the one with flowering plants and birds and insects and reef fish and coral reefs and diverse ecosystems of extraordinary complexity, was built from the ashes of the Permian world, not from nothing, from the 4%, from the survivors of the worst week, the worst year, the worst 60,000 years, the worst 10 million years in the history of complex life, from whatever made it through. You're looking at the world through the eyes of an animal whose most ancient ancestors stood in the Karoo 90 million years after the extinction and found a world that was livable again. That was small and warm-blooded and adaptable in a world rebuilding itself. That diversified into the Mesozoic and survived the dinosaur extinction and gave rise to everything that eventually gave rise to you. The world has nearly ended before, not once, multiple times. Each time something made it through. Each time the something that made it through became the new foundation of a new biological world. The biosphere is not immortal. individual worlds within it, specific assemblages of species adapted to specific conditions, can be destroyed, have been destroyed, are recorded in the rock as lines, boundaries, the geological signatures of sudden impoverishment. But life itself, the capacity to exist and diversify and build complexity, has never been extinguished, not by the Great Dying, not by any of the other mass extinctions in the record. The conditions that allow life to exist on this planet have remained within the range that life can tolerate, even at the worst moments. And from whatever was left, life rebuilt. That is what the Permian-Triassic extinction ultimately tells us, not just about the fragility of specific biological worlds, but about the resilience of life itself, about the capacity for recovery across timescales that make human history look like a passing moment, about the fact that however complete a catastrophe appears, the 4% that survive carry within them everything needed to rebuild. The Siberian traps burned themselves out eventually. The carbon dioxide was absorbed, the oceans reoxygenated, the temperature stabilized. The survivors had the planet to themselves and diversified into it. And 252 million years later, one of their descendants is lying in the dark thinking about what happened. That is not nothing. That is everything. There is one more chapter in this story that deserves telling. The chapter about what happens in the first years after the extinction peak. Not the millions of years of recovery, the specific, immediate years and decades after the worst of it. Because that immediate aftermath is where some of the most interesting and most recent science has been focused. The first thing to understand about the immediate aftermath of the Great Dying is that the killing did not stop at the boundary. The Permian-Triassic boundary, as defined by biostratigraphers, marks the moment of maximum extinction pulse. But the conditions that caused the extinction, the high temperatures, the low oxygen, the acidic oceans, the elevated UV, did not end at the boundary. They persisted, and in some cases they got worse before they got better. The early Triassic is characterized by multiple smaller extinction pulses, events that are less dramatic than the main boundary event but that repeatedly reset the recovering populations. Each time a lineage began to diversify and expand, another stress event reduced it again. The recovery was not a steady upward trend. It was a ragged, interrupted, frequently reversed process in which the biosphere fought for ground against continuing adverse conditions and periodically lost that ground before regaining it. The temperature data from the early Triassic, specifically the oxygen isotope record from shallow marine carbonates, shows something remarkable. The temperatures in the aftermath of the extinction were not simply elevated. They were extremely elevated, reaching values in some intervals that may have been the highest in the entire Phanerozoic, the last 540 million years of complex animal life. The early Triassic was hotter than even the peak of the extinction event in some records. Why? Because the Siberian trap's eruptions were not over. They continued to pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years after the main extinction pulse. The carbon dioxide that was already in the system was driving warming. And the biological feedbacks, the reduced photosynthesis, the disrupted carbon cycle, were amplifying rather than dampening the warming trend. This is the specific mechanism by which a mass extinction can be prolonged and deepened beyond the initial pulse. The biological systems that normally regulate climate, that absorb carbon dioxide, that produce oxygen, that cycle nutrients, were severely compromised by the extinction. A world with 97% of its marine species gone has a profoundly disrupted biogeochemical cycling capacity. The organisms that do this work are gone. The work does not get done. The system that killed the organisms continues to spiral because the organisms that would have stabilized it are no longer there to do so. The coal gap is the most graphic expression of this. The absence of coal-forming environments in the early Triassic is not just the absence of forests, it is the absence of the entire ecosystem service that forests provide. Forests transpire enormous quantities of water, cooling the local climate. Forests stabilize soils, preventing erosion and nutrient loss. Forests accumulate organic matter, sequestering carbon and moderating atmospheric carbon dioxide. When the forest died, these services stopped. The climate became more volatile, the soils eroded. The carbon dioxide that plants would have been absorbing stayed in the atmosphere. The world without forests is a less stable world, a more extreme world, hotter summers and colder winters in the continental interiors, more intense, rainfalls on bare soil carrying nutrients to the sea in pulses that fuel algal blooms and oxygen consumption, less atmospheric moisture recycling, making the interiors drier. The absence of forests in the early Triassic was not just an ecological loss, it was a disruption of climate regulation that made the already difficult conditions of the extinction aftermath more severe. And it was a profoundly strange world to be a terrestrial organism in. Imagine a landscape with no trees, not a grassland because grasses had not yet evolved, not a savanna because there was no ground cover dense enough to be called a savanna, something more like the surface of an alien planet, bare rock, dust, scattered ferns and some surviving horsetails in the wet areas. The occasional Lystrosaurus picking its way across a landscape that would have looked, to modern eyes, like the aftermath of a nuclear winter. The sky would have been different. The particulates from the Siberian traps eruptions and the thermogenic emissions from the heated sedimentary sequences were still in the stratosphere. The light quality was different. The colour of the sunsets was different. The UV levels with the compromised ozone layer were higher than in the preceding Permian. In the seas, the picture was similarly bleak, but with islands of relative activity. The bacterial mats that had flourished in the dying of the Permian, fed by the organic matter of billions of dead organisms, were still extensive in the shallow seas. Mats of cyanobacteria and other microbial communities, the kind of communities that had dominated the shallow seas before the Cambrian explosion of complex life, were re-expanding into the ecological space vacated by the complex organisms. The early Triassic is sometimes called the age of microbial mats, because these simple communities re-established a dominance they had not held since before complex animal life evolved. This is a profound regression. One of the outcomes of the Great Dying was that the shallow marine environment was temporarily taken over by the simplest form of aquatic biological community, the mat-forming microbes that had been outcompeted and marginalized by complex animals for hundreds of millions of years. The Permian, with its reefs and its brachiopod beds and its diverse mobile fauna, was replaced by something that looked more like the Precambrian. The evolutionary clock did not run backward. The genes were still there. The evolutionary potential was still there. But the ecological expression of biology in the early Triassic shallow seas was startlingly primitive relative to the Permian. It took the removal of the conditions that allowed the mats to dominate before the complex organisms could re-establish themselves. That removal took millions of years. The improvement in ocean chemistry, the reoxygenation, the temperature reduction, the pH recovery, happened gradually as the Siberian traps eruptions wound down, and as the biological feedback slowly rebalanced. And only then, as conditions improved, did the complex organisms have the chemical conditions they required to rebuild their populations. If you are still with me at this point in the story, still curious, still finding this worth your time, I want to say something directly. This kind of deep dive into the geology and biology of the ancient past is exactly what this channel is here to provide. If you have not yet subscribed, please consider doing so. Leave a like if this has been valuable to you. It makes a real difference in helping this channel continue and grow. And now, back to the story of recovery. The recovery from the Great Dying eventually accelerated as the early Triassic conditions improved. The key inflection point, the moment when the recovery began to look robust rather than tentative, appears to be approximately 2 to 4 million years after the extinction boundary. By this point, the Siberian traps eruptions had subsided enough that the volcanic forcing of climate was decreasing. The carbon dioxide, while still elevated, was beginning to be absorbed by the recovering biological pump. The temperatures in some regions were declining from their post-extinction peaks. The ocean chemistry was beginning to stabilize. In this improving environment, the survivors began to diversify more effectively. The archosaurs, which had been limited to a few lineages in the immediate aftermath, began the adaptive radiation that would produce the dinosaurs. The marine reptiles, the ichthyosaurs and their relatives, began to diversify into the empty marine ecological space. The bivalves expanded dramatically, filling roles that had been occupied by brachiopods for hundreds of millions of years. The ammonoids, reduced to a few lineages, began the explosive diversification that would produce hundreds of new species in just a few million years. The reef ecosystem began its recovery last, because reef building requires the most specific and stringent chemical conditions, and because the organisms capable of building reefs had been among the most severely affected. The Permian reef-building organisms, the rugose and tabulate corals and the sponge reefs, were essentially eliminated. Their replacement, the scleractinian corals that build modern reefs, appear in the fossil record in the Middle Triassic, several million years after the extinction. These new reef builders were related to but distinct from the Permian builders. They may have descended from zooxanthellae ancestors, corals that did not host symbiotic algae, that were able to survive the harsh early Triassic conditions that would have killed any zooxanthellate coral. In the improving Middle Triassic chemistry, they began to acquire symbiotic algae and to build reefs. The reappearance of reef ecosystems in the Middle Triassic is one of the most important milestones in the recovery from the Great Dying. Reefs are the richest and most diverse marine ecosystems. Their reappearance marks the restoration of the ecological complexity and productivity that the extinction had destroyed. The Middle Triassic reefs were smaller and simpler than the Permian reefs, but they were there. The foundation was being relaid. And from that foundation, through the Triassic and the Jurassic and the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic, marine biodiversity continued to build. The modern ocean, with its coral reefs and its fish diversity, and its extraordinarily complex food webs, is the current state of a recovery that began in the Middle Triassic from the near-zero baseline of the earliest Triassic. a recovery that has been ongoing for 247 million years and that has produced a biological complexity arguably exceeding anything that existed in the Permian. The worst extinction in Earth's history was not the end of the story. It was the most dramatic reset. A reset so severe that it cleared the biological slate to a degree unprecedented in the last 500 million years, and from that cleared slate, life rebuilt. Different from what was before, not inevitably better or worse, just different. What life always produces when given enough time, ecological space, and stable enough conditions: complexity, diversity, interconnection, beauty. Rest now. The Permian is 252 million years behind us. The survivors did their work. The recovery happened. The world that exists tonight, with all its complexity and all its beauty and all its fragility, is what 4% of life built from the ruins of the greatest catastrophe in Earth's history. You are the current end of a line that went through that, through the Siberian traps, through the hydrogen sulfide oceans, through the burning fern wastelands of the early Triassic, through 10 million years of slow recovery, through everything that came after, the line held. You are here. Let us go even deeper into the specific chemistry of the Permian-Triassic boundary. Because the geochemical evidence from this event is in some ways the most impressive forensic science ever applied to any event in Earth's history, and the picture it paints is extraordinary in its detail, the oxygen isotope record from Permian-Triassic boundary sections around the world tells us about temperature. When carbonate minerals crystallize from seawater, the ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 in the mineral depends on the temperature of the water. Cold water locks in more oxygen 18. Warm water incorporates less. By measuring the oxygen isotope composition of fossil shells and carbonate minerals from precisely dated boundary sections, paleoclimatologists can reconstruct the water temperature at the time the shells formed. The data from multiple sections, from China, from Iran, from Pakistan, from Greenland, from Italy, all tell the same story. The temperature increase across the boundary was rapid and large. Tropical sea surface temperatures that were perhaps 28 to 30 degrees Celsius in the latest Permian rose to 35 to 40 degrees during the extinction interval. Some sections show evidence of temperatures approaching 40 degrees in the warmest periods. 40 degrees Celsius in open ocean surface water is extraordinary. The modern tropical Pacific, the warmest large ocean region on Earth, reaches 31 degrees at its warmest. 40 degrees is approaching the thermal tolerance limit of virtually every marine organism alive today. In the Permian, for organisms that had evolved in the relatively stable thermal environment of the Tethys Sea, even 35 degrees would have been far beyond what their physiology could manage. The Bron isotope record tells us about ocean pH. Bron in seawater exists in two forms, boric acid and borate, and the ratio between them depends on pH. When carbonate minerals incorporate boron from seawater, the isotope ratio they preserve records the pH at the time of crystallization. The boron isotope data from Permian-Triassic boundary sections show a clear acidification signal, with pH dropping by perhaps half a unit or more during the extinction interval. Half a pH unit corresponds to roughly a threefold increase in hydrogen ion concentration. For organisms depending on carbonate saturation to build their shells, this change was devastating. The carbon isotope record is perhaps the most striking of all. Carbon exists in two stable isotopes, carbon-12 and carbon-13. Living organisms preferentially incorporate carbon-12 over carbon-13, during photosynthesis and metabolism. When organic matter is buried, it takes carbon-12 with it, leaving the ocean and atmosphere relatively enriched in carbon-13. When that buried organic matter is released, either by oxidation or by volcanic heating, it returns carbon-12 to the system, and the ratio shifts toward lighter values. The carbon isotope record across the Permian-Triassic boundary shows one of the most dramatic negative excursions in the entire geological record. The carbon-13 to carbon-12 ratio drops sharply at the boundary, indicating a massive injection of isotopically light carbon into the ocean atmosphere system. This is consistent with the release of volcanic carbon dioxide from the Siberian traps, the thermal decomposition of coal beds and other organic-rich sediments by magmatic heat, and possibly the destabilization of methane hydrates in the deep ocean by the warming. The scale of the carbon isotope excursion implies a carbon release so large that, even with the buffering capacity of the entire ocean, the atmospheric and oceanic chemistry was overwhelmed. The global carbon cycle, which normally operates to maintain relatively stable carbon dioxide levels over geological time, was completely disrupted, and the timing of this disruption in the high-precision records from well-preserved boundary sections is what makes the extinction story so compelling. The temperature increase and the carbon excursion and the extinction of species all happen in the same narrow stratigraphic interval, not a million years of warming followed by extinction, not extinction followed by carbon release, all of it simultaneously within the resolution of the dating methods, which in the best sections is a few thousand years. The cause and the effect are, within geological precision, coincident. There is one more piece of chemistry that deserves attention, a piece of evidence that is so specific and so dramatic that it changes how you think about the ocean during the extinction. Sulfur. Sulfur has multiple stable isotopes, and the ratio of sulfur 34 to sulfur 32 is sensitive to biological fractionation during the microbial sulfur cycle. When sulfate-reducing bacteria process sulfate from seawater, they preferentially use the lighter sulfur 32, leaving the remaining seawater sulfate enriched in sulfur 34. The measurement of sulfur isotope ratios in pyrite, the iron sulfide mineral that forms in anoxic sediments, gives information about the extent of bacterial sulfate reduction, and therefore about the extent of ocean anoxia. The sulfur isotope record from Permian-Triassic boundary sediments tells a story of catastrophic ocean anoxia that is consistent with and independent from the other proxies. The data show that at certain times during the extinction interval, the sulfur cycle was operating in a mode consistent with nearly complete anoxia in large parts of the ocean. Bacterial sulfate. Reduction was so extensive that the seafloor pyrite has the specific sulfur isotope signature of a strongly sulfidic environment. And then there are the biomarkers, the specific lipid molecules preserved in ancient sedimentary organic matter that identify the organisms that produced them. In Permian-Triassic boundary sediments from multiple locations around the world, researchers have found the specific biomarker signatures of green sulfur bacteria, also called chlorobiaceae. These bacteria are uniquely specialized. They are photosynthetic. They require both light and hydrogen sulfide to grow. They live at the bottom of the photic zone, the layer of the water column reached by sunlight, specifically in the narrow zone where light meets hydrogen sulfide that has diffused upward from the anoxic waters below. Green sulfur bacteria today are found only in stratified lakes and in very specific coastal environments, where anoxic, hydrogen sulfide-rich water reaches the photic zone. They are rare. They're geographically limited. They're indicators of a very specific and very unusual water chemistry. At the Permian-Triassic boundary, their biomarkers are found in sediments from the Tethys Sea, from the Panthalassa Ocean, from multiple sections on multiple paleocontinents. This means that the specific chemical conditions required for green sulfur bacteria to thrive, light and hydrogen sulfide together in the photic zone, were widespread across the global ocean at the time of the extinction, not just in deep, isolated basins, in the shallow water sections where the richest marine life had existed. The shallow seas were toxic. The water that had supported the reefs and the brachiopods and the ammonoids was laced with hydrogen sulfide produced by the bacterial blooms in the oxygen-free water below. The poison had reached the sunlit world where most life lived. This is the specific mechanism by which a warming and acidification event could have killed the things that survived warming and acidification. Corals bleached by warming but still alive. Brachiopods stressed by acidification but still filtering. Ammonoids retreating toward cooler waters. And then the hydrogen sulfide. Invisible. Heavier than air and water and settling into the hollows, concentrating in the shallow embayments, reaching the gills and tissues of every animal in the shallows. Death not from the slow accumulation of stress, but from acute poisoning. The faunas that managed to hang on through the warming and the acidification may have been finally eliminated by the hydrogen sulfide. The 97% may be lower than it would have been without the toxic ocean. The hydrogen sulfide may be the mechanism that pushed a severe extinction into the most devastating in Earth's history. Now let us go to Siberia, not 252 million years ago. Now, the Siberian traps are still there. 252 million years of weathering and erosion have removed much of the original volcanic sequence. But the remaining rocks still form a vast, thick sequence of black basaltic lava flows, interbedded ash deposits, and intrusive sills covering an area the size of Western Europe. In the remote wilderness of the West Siberian Basin and across the Tunguskan Platform, these rocks represent the physical remnant of the event that killed the Permian world. Geologists working in the Siberian traps today are doing some of the most important research in deep time extinction science. They are mapping the extent and volume of the volcanic sequences. They are dating individual flows with ever-increasing precision to reconstruct the tempo of the eruptions. They are analysing the chemical composition of the lavas to understand what gases they would have released. They are studying the contact zones where magma intruded into the Permian sedimentary sequences to quantify the thermogenic gas release from cooking coal and evaporates. The researchers who have been most influential in quantifying the Siberian traps eruptions include Seth Burgess and Ben Black, whose work on the intrusive component of the traps showed that the magma that intruded into the sedimentary sequences without reaching the surface, the sills and dikes, was a large fraction of the total magmatic volume and was responsible for the most dangerous gas releases. The thermogenic gas from sills heating coal beds and evaporates was probably more significant than the volcanic gas from the surface eruptions themselves. This was a surprising finding. It means the most dangerous component of the Siberian traps event was the part that was invisible at the surface, the magma cooking the rock from below, rather than erupting in dramatic surface eruptions. The dating work by Xu Zhongshen and his colleagues in China, using the most precise uranium-lead radiometric dating available, has established the main extinction pulse with remarkable precision. The extinction happened within 60,000 years. That date is now robust enough to be accepted by essentially all workers in the field. Whatever the Siberian traps did, they did it fast by geological standards, and the work of Paul Wignall and colleagues on the distribution of anoxic facies, the black shales and iron-bearing sediments that record oxygen-depleted conditions, has mapped the expansion of anoxia across the Permian-Triassic boundary globally. Anoxia reached not just the deep ocean, but the shallow carbonate shelves. The oxygen-poor water that expanded from the deep was not confined to depth. It invaded the habitats where life was most abundant. This convergence of evidence from isotope geochemistry, from biomarkers, from sedimentary facies, from radiometric dating, from volcanic geology, is what makes the Permian-Triassic extinction story one of the most thoroughly documented and rigorously constrained stories in all of geology. We cannot observe it directly, we cannot replay it in a laboratory, but the evidence it left in the rocks, preserved across 250 million years, is rich enough that the story can be reconstructed with genuine confidence. Let us think about the specific organisms that survived and why their survival was not random luck, but the outcome of specific biological strategies that were, in the conditions of the early Triassic, superior. Among the marine survivors, the nautiloids, the direct relatives of the living nautilus, made it through, while their more diverse relatives, the ammonoids, were reduced to a few lineages. Why? The nautilus is a deep water dweller, capable of descending to 500 meters or more. At depth, the hydrogen sulfide produced at the seafloor is diluted by the volume of water above it. At depth, the temperature increase is also more moderate than at the surface. The nautiloids were, by their ecology, buffered against the specific stresses that were killing the shallow water fauna. They were not better adapted to the changed conditions. They were in the wrong place to be as badly affected. Among the bivalves, certain groups that were capable of tolerating dysoxic conditions, low oxygen rather than anoxic conditions, had a survival advantage. Modern equivalents of these bivalves live at oxygen minimum zones in today's ocean, tolerated low oxygen by reducing their metabolic rate and behavioral activity. In the Permian Ocean, the organisms with this toolkit had an enormous advantage as oxygen levels fell. The fish, which were not the dominant vertebrate group in the Permian marine ecosystem, survived and diversified into the ecological roles vacated by the extinct organisms in the Triassic. This is why fish are so diverse and ecologically important today. The Permian extinction was devastating to the organisms that had dominated the seas for hundreds of millions of years. It was an opportunity for the fish, which were less dominant in the Permian but possessed of the metabolic and locomotory flexibility to survive the transition. On land, the key survival attributes appear to have been small body size, broad dietary tolerance, and possibly some degree of burrowing or subterranean habit. Small animals can survive on less food. They can hide in burrows where temperatures are more stable and UV exposure is reduced. They can shift their diet rapidly in response to changing food availability. The small, burrowing, omnivorous cynodont that survived the Great Dying to become the ancestor of all mammals was not the most impressive animal in the Permian ecosystem. It was the one best suited to being a survivor. There is a specific fossil site in the Karoo Basin that illustrates the survival strategy with extraordinary clarity. Deposits from just above the extinction boundary contain the remains of a small cynodont called Thrinaxodon. Thrinaxodon was a burrower. The evidence comes from casts of burrows in the sediment, some of them with Thrinaxodon skeletons inside. This animal survived the worst period in terrestrial ecological history by going underground, by hiding from the heat and the UV and the disrupted surface ecology in burrows where conditions were more stable. And Thrinaxodon was ancestrally close to the lineages that gave rise to mammals. We are in a sense the descendants of a small animal that survived a planetary catastrophe by hiding underground. That is not a diminishment. It is a fact that I find deeply moving. The strategy that preserved the mammalian lineage through the worst event in Earth's history was the strategy of being small and flexible and willing to go underground when the surface became uninhabitable. Not the strategy of size and dominance that characterized the gorgonopsids and the large dicynodonts, all of which went extinct. The strategy of modesty and adaptability and hiding. And from that strategy, from that small burrowing animal in its tunnel in the Karoo 252 million years ago, the entire lineage of mammals eventually developed. The whales in the ocean, the bats in the sky, the elephants on the African savanna, the primates in the forests, the single species of human that eventually looked back in time and reconstructed the event that made its own existence possible. Something about the Permian-Triassic extinction keeps drawing researchers back to it, year after year, decade after decade. Not just because of its scale, though the scale is extraordinary, but because of what it represents as a test case. The Earth system is complex. It has multiple interacting components: the atmosphere, the ocean, the biosphere, the rock cycle, the carbon cycle. These components influence each other through physical and chemical and biological feedbacks. The whole system is capable of maintaining stability over very long periods, and then, under specific circumstances, it is capable of catastrophic instability, of state changes that happen faster than the biological world can adapt to. The Permian-Triassic extinction is the most thoroughly documented example of a catastrophic state change in the Earth system in the last 500 million years. It was not caused by an asteroid impact, an external insult that could not have been anticipated from the state of the system. It was caused by a process that was internal to the Earth, a geological process operating through perfectly well understood physical and chemical mechanisms: volcanism, greenhouse warming, ocean acidification, anoxia, hydrogen sulfide toxicity, each mechanism individually understood, the cascade of all of them together producing the worst biological catastrophe in Earth's history. The question this raises is whether the Earth system, the same system operating today, is vulnerable to similar cascades under different triggering conditions. And the answer that the Permian-Triassic extinction provides is yes. Under the right conditions, the Earth system can produce a cascade of interconnected failures that kills most of the biosphere. The right conditions in the Permian were sustained: large-scale carbon injection into the atmosphere combined with a vulnerable ocean chemistry. Those conditions are not unique to the Permian. They're conditions that the Earth system can reach whenever the carbon cycle is sufficiently perturbed. I want to be careful here, because the comparison deserves precision. The Permian-Triassic extinction was caused by an event, the Siberian traps eruptions, that was extraordinary in its scale even within the context of geological history. Large igneous provinces of the Siberian traps magnitude are rare. They occur on timescales of hundreds of millions of years. The Permian-Triassic extinction is not a common event. It is the worst event in the last 500 million years. The conditions that caused it were extreme, even by geological standards. The relevance to the present is not that we are doing what the Siberian traps did. We are not. The relevance is that the mechanisms involved are universal. Ocean acidification from elevated carbon dioxide is happening today at a lower rate than at the boundary, but in the same chemical direction. Ocean deoxygenation from warming is a documented trend in the modern ocean. These are not projections or models, they are measurements. The direction is the same as at the Permian-Triassic boundary. The magnitude is orders of magnitude smaller, but the mechanisms are the same mechanisms, and the geological record of what those mechanisms can do at their extreme is the Permian-Triassic boundary. The record in the rocks is not a prediction. It is a calibration point. It tells us what the extreme looks like. It tells us where the mechanisms lead if they run unchecked. That information is not useless. Understanding the worst case that the Earth system has produced is relevant to understanding the risks of perturbing the same systems today. This is why the Permian-Triassic extinction is studied not just by paleontologists interested in ancient life, but by ocean chemists modelling future acidification, by climate scientists modelling ocean circulation, by biologists studying modern reef systems. The boundary is a natural experiment run at scales and conditions we could never replicate in a laboratory, that constrains our understanding of how the Earth system responds to chemical and thermal perturbations. The lesson is not that catastrophe is inevitable. The lesson is that the mechanisms are real, that they interact and amplify each other, and that the biological consequences of letting them run to extremes are severe enough to appear in the rock record as a line that separates the living world from near nothing. The dissynodonts deserve a final word, because they are in some ways the most poignant characters in the Permian extinction story. The dissynodonts were the most successful and abundant large herbivores of the Permian. Dozens of species, ranging from the size of a dog to the size of a hippopotamus. They were everywhere. Every Permian terrestrial ecosystem in the tropics and subtropics had dissynodonts. They had 2 tusks, which they use for digging up roots and tubers. They had a turtle-like beak for cropping vegetation. Their skulls were distinctive and immediately recognizable in the fossil record. They browsed the Glossopteris forests. They grazed the riverbanks. They were the dominant large herbivores of an entire world. At the extinction boundary, they nearly all disappeared. Of the dozens of Permian dissynodont species, only 2 or 3 lineages made it through. One of them, Lystrosaurus, became one of the most abundant terrestrial vertebrates in the world for the first few million years of the Triassic. Lystrosaurus was not large, not impressive, not particularly specialized. It was small and generalist and apparently extremely tolerant of the disturbed conditions of the early Triassic. At some sites, Lystrosaurus fossils make up 90% or more of the vertebrate fauna, an ecological dominance that reflects not the success of Lystrosaurus, but the absence of everything else. Eventually, the Lystrosaurus-dominated world gave way to a more diverse Triassic fauna as the recovery proceeded, and other lineages diversified to fill the vacant ecological roles. The dissynodonts themselves persisted in reduced diversity for tens of millions of years into the Triassic, before finally going extinct in the Cretaceous period, outlasting their Permian dominance by over 200 million years, but never again approaching the diversity and abundance they had achieved in the Permian. The fossil record of the Permian-Triassic boundary in the Karoo, where the dissynodont fossils are so well preserved, is a kind of geological memorial to a world that was. The bones of gorgonopsids and dicynodonts and cynodonts, and the other Permian fauna, abundantly preserved in the red mudstones below the boundary, tell the story of a biological world of extraordinary richness. The near absence of diverse fauna in the earliest Triassic sediments above the boundary tells the story of what the Siberian traps did to it. And the gradual return of diversity in the younger Triassic deposits tells the story of what survival and recovery look like over geological time. It is a story preserved in red mud in South Africa, a story that started 252 million years ago, and that is still being read, carefully and with increasing precision, by researchers who find meaning in understanding the worst thing that ever happened to the history of complex life. The sun is still up over Siberia tonight, in whatever season it is where you're listening. The Siberian traps are still there, worn down to their roots, the ancient basalt exposed along river cliffs and in the walls of mine pits, recognizable to a geologist as the signature of the event that ended the Permian world. The rocks do not look like weapons. They look like ordinary black stone, but they are the most dangerous geological formation in Earth's history. 3 million cubic kilometers of lava and the gases it carried, and the gases it cooked out of the Permian sedimentary sequences below it, changed the chemistry of an entire planet in 60,000 years, changed the temperature of the ocean, changed the pH of the water, removed the oxygen from the depths, filled the shallows with poison, and killed 97% of everything that swam or crawled or burrowed or grew in the sunlit world. You can hold a piece of Siberian traps basalt in your hand. It weighs what any rock weighs. It has the rough texture of basalt, grey and slightly crystalline. There is nothing about its appearance that tells you what it did, what it is. The monument to the worst event in the history of complex life. The 4% survived. They always do. Something always survives. That is one of the most important things the geological record tells us about life on this planet. Life is difficult to exterminate completely. Not impossible, but difficult. The conditions required to sterilize a planet are more extreme than any mass extinction in Earth's record has achieved. Life retreats, life is reduced, life waits, and then life recovers. 252 million years later, in the warmth of whatever shelter you are resting in tonight, one of the descendants of those 4% is listening to the story of what their ancestors survived. That feels like something. Not a simple feeling and not one that resolves into easy comfort, but something real and important and worth sitting with for a moment before sleep. The Permian is 252 million years behind us. The Siberian traps have been quiet for 250 million years. The recovery from the Great Dying has been ongoing for almost as long. The world we live in, the world of flowering plants and birds and mammals and coral reefs, and all the extraordinary biological richness of the modern biosphere, is the product of that recovery. Built by the 4% who survived. Built over 10 million years of slow rebuilding. Built into something as complex and beautiful as what was destroyed. Not the same. Never the same. The specific organisms of the Permian are gone. The specific biological interactions, the specific ecologies, the specific evolutionary histories of the lineages that were extinguished, those are irretrievably lost. You cannot rebuild the exact Permian biosphere from its survivors any more than you can reconstruct a burned library from the few books that did not catch fire. But something was built. Something rich and complex and worth inhabiting, worth protecting, worth understanding deeply enough to treat with the care it deserves. The rocks remember everything. The boundary is still there. The story is still legible, and the lessons about fragility and resilience and the real costs of pushing the Earth system to its extremes are still relevant. Rest now. The Permian world is gone. The world built from its survivors is still here, still evolving, still finding its way, still asking questions about where it came from and what it is and what it owes to the organisms whose extinction made its existence possible. Those questions are worth carrying gently, quietly, into whatever dreams come. Let us spend some time with the other mass extinctions, because the Permian-Triassic boundary does not exist in isolation. It is the worst event in a series of extinction events that punctuate the history of complex life, and understanding where it sits in that series is important for understanding both its uniqueness and the patterns it shares with the others. Earth's biological history has 5 recognized mass extinctions, events in which a large fraction of all species were eliminated in a geologically brief period. The Permian-Triassic is the largest, but the other 4 are each instructive in their own right, and each is relevant to understanding the mechanisms that make extinction events catastrophic rather than simply significant. The first of the big 5 in geological time is the End-Ordovician extinction, approximately 445 million years ago. This was a 2-pulse event associated with a brief but severe glaciation. During the glaciation, sea levels dropped dramatically as water was locked in ice sheets, exposing and drying the shallow water habitats where most marine life lived. Temperatures dropped sharply, stressing the organisms that had evolved in the warm, stable seas of the Ordovician. Then, as the glaciation ended and temperatures rose again, the resulting anoxia and sea level changes produced a second pulse. Together, the 2 pulses eliminated roughly 85% of marine species. Not as severe as the Permian event, but still extraordinary in scale. The second is the late Devonian extinction, approximately 375 million years ago. This was a prolonged affair, spread across perhaps 20 million years, with multiple distinct extinction pulses. The dominant mechanism appears to have been ocean anoxia, driven in part by nutrient runoff from the expanding land plant communities that were colonizing continental interiors for the first time. Land plants, as they spread across previously bare rock, accelerated weathering and delivered large quantities of phosphorus and nitrogen to the oceans. Nutrient loading caused blooms of marine algae. The decomposition of those blooms consumed oxygen. The resulting anoxia killed the marine communities that had developed in the warm Devonian seas. Approximately 70 to 80% of all species were lost. The third is the Permian-Triassic, which we've now explored in depth. The fourth is the End-Triassic extinction, approximately 201 million years ago. This event is less studied than the Permian-Triassic and less severe, eliminating perhaps 70 to 80% of species, but it is interesting for its mechanism. The cause is another large igneous province, the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, which erupted as the supercontinent Pangaea began to break apart and the Atlantic Ocean was forming. The same volcanic mechanism, the same greenhouse gas injection, a smaller version of the Permian-Triassic story, causing a smaller but still catastrophic extinction. And interestingly, the End-Triassic extinction may have helped open the ecological space for the dinosaurs to diversify into global dominance in the Jurassic. The fifth is the end Cretaceous extinction, 66 million years ago. This is the most famous of the five because of the dramatic asteroid impact at Chicxulub in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. The 10-kilometre impactor struck at a speed of approximately 20 kilometres per second, releasing energy equivalent to roughly 10 billion Hiroshima bombs. The immediate effects, the blast wave, the thermal pulse from ejecta re-entering the atmosphere, the global fires were severe. But the more sustained and biologically destructive effect was the impact winter, the injection of so much dust and sulfuric acid aerosol into the stratosphere that photosynthesis was suppressed globally for months to years. The plant-based food webs collapsed. The large animals that depended on them died. Approximately 75% of species were eliminated. The Chicxulub extinction is sometimes presented as evidence that we need not worry about volcanic mechanisms because the most dramatic extinction anyone can name was caused by an asteroid. This is a misreading of the evidence. Chicxulub eliminated fewer species than the Permian-Triassic event, and the volcanic mechanisms involved in the Great Dying were more severe and more sustained than the Chicxulub impact's effects. The dramatic visual narrative of the asteroid impact should not obscure the fact that the quieter, more sustained process of volcanic carbon injection was capable of producing a worse outcome. There is also growing evidence that the Deccan Traps, a large igneous province in India that was erupting at the same time as the Chicxulub impact, contributed to the end Cretaceous extinction. The Deccan eruptions had been ongoing for hundreds of thousands of years before the impact and continued for hundreds of thousands of years after. Some researchers argue that the extinction was already underway from the Deccan eruptions before the asteroid arrived, and that the impact simply administered the final blow to a biosphere already weakened by volcanic stress. This remains debated, but it illustrates the complexity of the boundary events and the challenge of attributing all extinction to a single cause. What the 5 mass extinctions have in common is this: they all involve rapid changes to the chemistry of the atmosphere and ocean, specifically to the thermal, oxidative and acidic conditions that define the habitability of the marine and terrestrial realms: temperature, oxygen, pH. These are the 3 axes along which mass extinction operates. Whether the driver is volcanism or glaciation or asteroid impact, the biological catastrophe follows from disruption of these 3 variables individually or in combination. The Permian-Triassic was the worst because it disrupted all 3 axes simultaneously, to extreme degrees, driven by a volcanic event of unprecedented scale, operating over long enough to destroy the entire foundation of the marine ecosystem, and severe enough to eliminate the possibility of ecological refugia across most of the planet. The recovery from the Great Dying created a world that was, in some respects, an evolutionary blank slate. The ecological roles vacated by the extinct Permian fauna were not filled immediately. They remained open, ecological space without occupants, for millions of years. And when organisms did begin to diversify into these roles, the specific lineages that filled them were determined not by some predetermined plan, but by which survivors happened to have the evolutionary capacity to radiate into the available space. This contingency is one of the most important concepts in evolutionary biology. Evolution is not directed. It does not work toward any particular outcome. The organisms that diversify after an extinction are not the organisms best suited for the new world in some absolute sense. They are the survivors who happened to be present when the ecological space opened up. and they diversify into that space using the evolutionary toolkit they happen to have. The archosaurs, the group that gave rise to dinosaurs, crocodilians, pterosaurs, and eventually birds, were minor components of the late Permian fauna. They were not prominent, they were not dominant, they were not, in any obvious way, the organisms destined to inherit the Earth. But they survived the Great Dying, and in the aftermath they had access to ecological roles vacated by the extinct therapsid fauna, and they diversified into those roles with extraordinary speed. Within a few million years of the extinction, the early archosaurs were evolving into the forms that would become the dinosaurs. Within 20 million years, the archosaurs had diversified into the dominant large land animals of the Triassic world. The ecological space the Gorgonopsids had occupied was filled by archosaur predators. The ecological space the large Dicynodonts had occupied was being filled by large herbivorous dinosaur precursors. The roles persisted, the occupants changed, and the cynodonts, the mammal ancestors, were meanwhile occupying the small-bodied ecological space, the nocturnal niches, the burrowing niches, the omnivorous niches, evolving in the shadows of the archosaurs for the next 150 million years, generating diversity quietly, experimenting with the anatomical innovations, the milk production, the placentation, the enhanced hearing derived from transformed jawbones that would eventually define mammals, waiting for another catastrophe to open the space for them to expand into. That catastrophe came 66 million years ago, when the Chicxulub asteroid eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs and most other large vertebrates, and the mammals inherited a world emptied of the large animals that had excluded them for so long. In the 10 million years after the end Cretaceous extinction, the mammals diversified into every ecological role vacated by the dinosaurs. Whales evolved from terrestrial mammals that returned to the sea. Bats evolved powered flight independently of the pterosaurs. The large herbivore roles were filled by the ancestors of modern horses and rhinos and elephants. The apex predator roles were filled by the ancestors of modern big cats. The primates, the order that includes us, began their adaptive radiation. 2 extinctions separated by nearly 200 million years, each one catastrophic, together responsible for the specific biological world we inhabit. The Permian Triassic made the world safe for archosaurs and set the stage for the dinosaur era. The end Cretaceous made the world safe for mammals and set the stage for us. We are the inheritors of catastrophe, twice over. The specific sequence of events that produced the human lineage required both extinctions to happen in the sequence they happened. Different extinctions at different times would have produced different biological worlds with different survivors, leading to different evolutionary outcomes. The human species is not the inevitable culmination of a directed evolutionary process. It is one specific contingent outcome of a sequence of historical accidents, including 2 of the worst biological catastrophes in the history of complex life. That is a profound kind of contingency, a humbling kind. Let me tell you about a fossil site in China that has transformed our understanding of the earliest days of the Triassic recovery. The Chaohu locality in Anhui Province, China, contains sediments from the very earliest Triassic, deposited in the first few 100,000 years after the extinction boundary. These sediments are not rich in fossils. The world was still desolate, but they are not empty, and the organisms preserved in them tell a specific and important story about how life begins to rebuild after catastrophe. Among the earliest Triassic organisms at Chaohu are ichthyosaurs, not the large dolphin-shaped ichthyosaurs of the Jurassic and Cretaceous that many people know from museum reconstructions. The Kauhu ichthyosaurs are small, eel-like animals, the earliest representatives of a lineage that would eventually become the most hydrodynamically sophisticated reptiles the ocean has ever produced. And they appear in the fossil record almost immediately after the extinction boundary. This is striking. The ichthyosaurs are reptiles that return to the sea. They evolved from terrestrial ancestors that, at some point in the early Triassic, began spending more and more time in the water. The transition from land to sea is not a simple evolutionary step. It requires extensive anatomical modification, behavioral change, and ecological transition. And yet the ichthyosaurs appear in the fossil record astonishingly early after the extinction, suggesting that the transition from land to sea happened rapidly, driven by the specific ecological conditions of the early Triassic. What were those conditions? The land was devastated. The terrestrial food web had collapsed. The forests were gone. The large herbivores were nearly gone. The apex predators were entirely gone. The land was, in the immediate aftermath of the extinction, the worst possible environment for a large-bodied vertebrate to try to make a living in. The ocean, despite its own devastation, was recovering faster in some respects. The productivity of the ocean, driven by phytoplankton rather than by complex multicellular plants, can recover faster from chemical perturbation than a terrestrial forest ecosystem. Within a few 100,000 years of the extinction, primary productivity in the ocean was recovering. Fish populations were rebuilding. Food was available in the sea. For a small reptile on the devastated Triassic shoreline, the ocean was opportunity. The competition in the sea was reduced. The food was there. And the reptiles that began to exploit it found themselves in an enormous available ecological space, an ocean full of resources and almost empty of large predators. The rapid diversification of ichthyosaurs in the earliest Triassic is the evolutionary response to that opportunity. The same pattern played out multiple times in the Triassic. Groups that had been minor in the Permian, finding the world after the extinction open to them in ways that it had not been before, radiating rapidly into the available space. The archosaurs on land, the ichthyosaurs and later the plesiosaurs in the ocean, the evolution of the Mesozoic world from the wreckage of the Permian. Each of these radiations began small. A few surviving lineages, reduced in diversity and abundance, exploring the edges of the available ecological space, gradually diversifying, gradually filling more and more of the roles, gradually building the interconnections and dependencies that constitute a functioning ecosystem, over millions of years transforming the impoverished, simplified world of the early Triassic into the rich, complex world of the Jurassic. Recovery is not restoration. The Jurassic world was not the Permian world, but it was, in its own way, extraordinary. The dinosaurs were extraordinary. The marine reptiles were extraordinary. The early mammals, small and nocturnal and overlooked, were laying the groundwork for something that would not become apparent for another 150 million years. The history of life is not a straight line. It is a series of collapses and recoveries, each one building on the specific subset of survivors from the previous catastrophe, each one producing a world that was shaped by both the potential of the survivors and the specific conditions they found themselves in. The world we live in is the current state of that process. One specific outcome of a vast number of contingencies, any one of which going differently would have produced a different world. There is one more thing I want to say before we close. One more thing that the Permian-Triassic extinction teaches us, beyond the specific mechanisms and the specific biology, it is about the meaning of time. 252 million years is an incomprehensible period. Our evolutionary lineage has existed as anatomically modern humans for perhaps 300,000 years. Written history spans about 5,000 years. The Roman Empire, which dominated the Western world for centuries, and whose influence is still present in the language you're reading and the laws that organize your society, lasted less than 1,000 years. Against these scales, 252 million years is an abyss, and yet the Permian-Triassic extinction is accessible to us. Not directly, not experientially, but scientifically. We can read its record in the rocks. We can reconstruct its chemistry. We can date its timing to within tens of thousands of years. We can identify the specific biological mechanisms by which it killed specific categories of organisms. We can trace the evolutionary consequences of its survivors across 250 million years of subsequent life. This is one of the most extraordinary achievements of the scientific enterprise, the ability to reach back 252 million years and reconstruct the chemistry of an ocean that no longer exists, inhabited by organisms that have been gone for longer than the dinosaurs lived. The ability to hold that history in our minds and extract from it specific, quantified information about what happened and why. The story of the Permian-Triassic extinction is not just a story about deep time. It is a story about human cognition, about the specific capacity of the human mind to reconstruct events that no human was present to witness, using evidence that those events left in their wake: the isotopes in the fossil shells, the biomarkers in the ancient sediment, the sulfur in the pyrite, the carbon in the limestone. These are not just scientific data. They are messages from the dead world of the Permian, preserved in chemistry and rock across 252 million years, waiting for an organism capable of reading them to evolve. We are that organism, the one that evolved from the 4% of survivors of the worst catastrophe in Earth's history to be capable of understanding what happened to that catastrophe's victims, to reconstruct the last days of the Permian world, to give names to the organisms that died, to quantify the temperature of the ocean that poisoned them, to trace the volcanic province that started the cascade, to hold the whole terrible story in our minds and find it meaningful. That is not nothing. It is something that has never existed before in the history of this planet. The capacity to look backward through deep time and understand what happened, and to find in that understanding both humility and responsibility. The Permian organisms did not know they were going to be part of the worst extinction in Earth's history. They were just living in the way that organisms live, occupying their ecological roles, finding food, reproducing, dying. The catastrophe arrived and they died, most of them, and they did not know why, and they did not understand the scale of what they were part of. We know, we understand, we have the chemistry and the isotopes and the biomarkers and the radiometric dates. We understand what happened and how and why, and we understand, because of that understanding, what the conditions that caused it were, and whether those conditions are present in the world we live in now, in what degree and at what rate. That knowledge is the most specific gift the Permian-Triassic extinction has given us, not the dinosaurs, which are a consequence of a later extinction, not the mammals, which are a consequence of an even later one. The gift of the great dying is the knowledge itself, the ability to read the worst event in Earth's biological history in the chemistry of ancient rocks, and to extract from it a calibration of what the mechanisms we are currently activating are capable of at their extreme. Use that knowledge wisely, hold it carefully, let it inform how you think about the world you live in without overwhelming you with a despair that is not warranted. Because the Great Dying also tells us that the biosphere recovers, that life is difficult to extinguish, that the 4% who survive become the foundation of the next world. The line in the Karoo that separates the Permian from the Triassic, that you can step over in a single stride, that represents the worst biological catastrophe in Earth's history, is not the end of the story. It is a transition from one world to another, through near nothing, and then gradually into something that built over millions of years into the world that eventually produced the eyes reading these words. The lane is real. The recovery is also real. Both things are true. The worst thing that happened to life on Earth also produced the world that contains us. That is not a comfortable synthesis, but it is an honest one. Rest now. The Permian is 252 million years behind us. The Siberian traps have been quiet for almost that long. The recovery from the Great Dying has been building slowly and without direction for 250 million years. And the world that recovery produced is here tonight, around you, made of organisms whose deepest ancestors survived the worst catastrophe in the history of complex life. Think about the specific chain of survival that connects you to the Permian. Your most ancient mammalian ancestors were small, warm-blooded, probably burrowing animals in the Triassic and Jurassic. They survived the Great Dying by being small and flexible, and willing to live underground when the surface became uninhabitable. They survived the Chicxulub extinction by being small and flexible, and living underground when the asteroid winter made the surface uninhabitable for large animals. They diversified in the Eocene warmth into the many lineages of modern mammals. The primate lineage emerged from that diversification, and the hominin lineage emerged from the primates in Africa a few million years ago. Every link in that chain had to hold. The small cynodont in its Triassic burrow, the small shrew-like mammal in its Cretaceous hiding place, the primate ancestor in the Eocene forest, the hominin on the African savanna. Every ancestor in the chain survived, reproduced, passed forward whatever combination of biology and behavior and circumstance allowed them to become an ancestor rather than a dead end. You are the current furthest point of that chain, not the end, the current furthest point. The chain is still extending in you and in everyone around you and in every other living thing on this planet, built from the same deep biological heritage of survival and adaptation and contingent good fortune. The Permian organisms that died in the Great Dying did not know they were going to be replaced. They did not know that their extinction would open ecological space for archosaurs, or that the archosaurs would give way to mammals, or that the mammals would eventually produce something capable of reconstructing what had happened to the Permian biosphere 252 million years later. They just lived, and were killed, and were replaced. The replacement was not inevitable. It was contingent on specific organisms surviving in specific places with specific biological toolkits. It required luck at every step, in every generation, across 252 million years, and here you are, the product of all that luck, aware of the story that produced you. That awareness is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about being human. Not the technology, not the civilization, not the abstract reasoning capacity. The awareness that we exist within a story that is immeasurably longer than ourselves, that our existence is contingent on an improbably long chain of survival events, and that we can, with enough scientific work, actually reconstruct that chain and find our place within it. The Permian boundary in the Karoo is not just a geological feature, it is part of your autobiography, the story of what almost prevented you from existing, the story of the 4% whose survival was your precondition, the story of how the world ended and then, slowly and without direction, became something that could produce the eyes that are reading these words. Let that settle around you gently. The incomprehensibility of the timescales, the strangeness of the contingency, the specific, factual, scientific reality that you are here because 97% of marine species and 70% of land vertebrates were eliminated 252 million years ago. And the 4% that survived built the biological foundation from which you eventually emerged. That is your deepest history. Deeper than any culture or civilization or species memory. Written in the rocks of South Africa and China and Greenland and everywhere, the Permian-Triassic boundary outcrops. Preserved in the chemistry of ancient shells. Recorded in the isotopes of fossils and the biomarkers of ancient bacteria and the sulfur of boundary pyrite. The rocks remember everything. They hold the story with perfect fidelity across 252 million years, waiting for an animal evolved enough to read it. You are that animal, and the story is astonishing. Rest now. Let the Permian world drift down to its resting place at the bottom of geological time. Let the Siberian traps cool in your imagination back to the quiet black basalt they are today. Let the 97% rest in the deep Triassic shales that hold their absence, and let the 4%, the survivors, the ancestors of everything, go on doing what they have been doing for 252 million years, living, adapting, persisting. Sleep well,